if you look at the top line numbers, kind of the, you know, above the line, as they say in LA where I live, numbers, Charlotte has a lot of positives that it can tell about its economic story. Mecklenburg County has added 100,000 people from 2010 to 2015. You've had job growth of 16%, which puts you in the top 15 metros. You've had significant increase in the GDP of the metro area, and even wages have gone up. I think it ranks 10th of the 100 largest metros. But the question which we discussed earlier today was, to what extent is any of that growth relevant to a kid growing up in one of the community's low-income neighborhoods? To what extent has Charlotte been able to find ways to connect its own low-income and minority communities to the growth it is experiencing? James?
I think it depends on who that kid is, what that kid looks like, where that kid lives, what income bracket that child comes from. I think those are largely the determinants. And whether or not the city has done enough, I think the answer, is affirmatively no. Mm-hmm. When you rank dead last in the country, as everybody knows in Charlotte, they hate this number, yeah. Dead last in economic mobility out of the 50 largest cities and 99th in terms of the county. I think there's obviously something wrong there, and it's undeniable that race absolutely colors, sorry for the pun, but determines so much of what that child's opportunities are. And obviously income is a part of that, but race and income are very connected and very strongly correlated. So I would say the answer is depends on who that kid is.
Oliver?
Well, I feel like this is like living in Charlotte. Like it's growing so much, but also it's leaving a lot of people behind. It feels like a golden cage almost. Like there's jobs, but the jobs that are here, like it's hard to survive on minimum wage. It's even hard to survive on 10 hours or $10 an hour. For like you have to have another second job to do that. And for the community that I'm part of and I work with, if you're undocumented, like there's like extra burdens that you have to suffer. And I think sometimes we fail to recognize that, and that there's people here in our community that are, you know, despite all the difficulties that they have, they're thriving, but there's still so much that we can do for them.
Brenda, you know, when John Hickenlooper is now the governor of Colorado, but before that he was the mayor of Denver, and he used to talk about something he called the Denver paradox. And he said, basically, we have a community and an economy that attracts smart young people from all over the country and all over the world to come here for the opportunities that we're creating, but we can't put our own kids on a track to compete for the jobs that we're building around us. To what extent does that verdict apply to Charlotte as well?
I think it absolutely applies. When we think about some of the statistics, the data that has really been part of the national discourse more recently, Charlotte ranks 50 of 50 in intergenerational socioeconomic mobility. Charlotte ranked 99th out of 100, or Mecklenburg County ranked 99 out of 100 in income equality. When we talk about the folks who are at the lowest quintile, those are native Charlotteans. That study looked at a cohort of young people and now adults who came up in the 1980s. Most of those folks have been here all of their lives. And so when we talk about the superlatives and the pull factors, Charlotte invites roughly about 50 people a day to the city. Most of which are being drawn to our banking industry and the incredible array of schools that we have. But what about the native Charlotteans? I think that's one of the critical questions we have to ask if we really want to talk about mobility in Charlotte.
Come back to that 1 second. Lee, we could walk out from here, and as we were saying before, you will walk in a few blocks in any directions and see things that were not there 15 or 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of new building, there's a lot of new development, there's a lot of new tax base, but there are also pressures on housing costs and competition for communities and access. For those native Charlottinians? Charlotteans. That was good. I'd not heard that before. Charlotte, for someone who's here, is this development a positive? How is this development improving their lives in any material way, or is it in some ways making it harder?
It's definitely making it harder.
It's making
I
it
think
harder.
the biggest stress we're seeing is because downtown has become so popular, a lot of the older inner ring neighborhoods where a lot of those original Charlotteans have lived for 60, 70 years. So we work in neighborhoods and build housing in neighborhoods where folks have lived all their lives. And they're finally getting to a point where other people want to come and live in those neighborhoods, and they're seeing gentrification pressures. So the opportunity is if we build enough housing and we allow them to stay in those neighborhoods, they can benefit from all of that new growth, from the new tax base, and from the new services that'll come with that investment. But if they just get displaced, then what really have they benefited?
What's the right goal? Is the goal to prevent new people from coming in, or is it to basically integrate them with the people who are already there and avoid them being moved out?
Our goal in housing, my goal has always been, and I think it helps with a lot of the problems, whether it's education or economic opportunity, is if we can integrate neighborhoods, we solve a lot of problems. But that goes two ways. You can take middle and higher income neighborhoods and build new affordable housing in those neighborhoods that integrates it one way. Or you can also, at the same time, have neighborhoods that are seeing folks wanting to live there. You want to invite those folks in. You want those folks to come in because that integrates your neighborhood as long as you allow the folks that are there to stay. So I don't think we want to say, please don't come, please don't come. We want people to invest, but we want to just make sure that the existing residents benefit from that.
Do you agree with that?
Somewhat. On the one hand, I think the integration is important, but not integration for the sake of integration. I think it's important to recognize and appreciate the value and the agency of the folks who already live there, that they are deserving of those opportunities, whether or not they live in proximity to somebody else who is more prosperous or not. So ultimately, I think the overall goal would be to create a more just, a more equitable, a more humane community, one that is compassionate and one that doesn't allow your demographics to determine your destiny. As she mentioned, folks from Charlotte, and I'm not a Charlatan. I'm a
You learn how to
transplant.
pronounce it. That's good.
That's job one. You can't say charlatan, so you got to figure out what the actual term is. Not charlatan, it's charlatan. But you know, I have been one of those individuals who's been blessed. For me, coming from a Rust Belt city in northern Illinois, this was my promised land. But what I had to recognize was the greater landscape was that people have been here for generations, and they didn't need a researcher or a study group or any of that to tell them that they were locked out. Right? And so what we need now is we need to figure out how do we shape the systems and the structures to make sure that whether or not affordable housing is available, which it absolutely has to be, but wherever I live, I'm not locked out from the opportunities that are present.
Talk about locked out. Can we call up the first slide? I hope. We'll see if we can. So the National Equity Atlas, which is a group called PolicyLink out of the Bay Area that many of you may know, studies demographic and economic trends in the major cities in America. And if you look at this, it's pretty incredible. This is the the median hourly wage in inflation-adjusted dollars for whites and people of color in the Charlotte metro area. And you can see that despite all of the growth in this community, the gap is actually bigger than it was when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, right? So the gap is actually wider today than it was 35 years ago. With all the jobs, all the growth, everything that's happened, Brenda, how do we end up in that situation? And we could add that the poverty rate is about 1 in 9 among white families, about 1 in 4 for people of color, both African Americans and Latinos. How do we end up with these disparities persisting despite a generation of really transformative growth?
I think that we have to remind ourselves that the definitions of, for instance, affordable housing have also changed since the 80s. We've often defined or conflated affordable housing with low income. That simply isn't the case. I know too many professors, too many teachers, folks that would have in the 1980s qualified as middle class who can't find housing. And if you think about Also, if you think about some of the data that is available, for instance, on the Charlotte Housing Authority website, you'll note that roughly 30,000 Charlotteans are waiting to find Section 8 vouchers. 30,000. So we can't underestimate the social and economic challenges that people in our city are having in spite of sort of this reputation of being a opportunity-rich community.
Yeah.
And also I think if our purview is Center City, we have a very short-sighted sense of the vast reality that exists beyond the contours of Center City. And we have to figure out how to understand our city beyond just simply what's happening here.
Oliver, can I ask you, Charlotte is like a lot of cities east of the Mississippi where the historical dynamic and the tensions and the struggles and the friction were basically binary. It was white and black. That's right. But now you have new elements, significant new elements. From 2000 to 2010, the Latino population increased 153%. The Asian American population doubled in the Charlotte metro. The black population increased 40%, white population 17%. You have these new communities that have emerged. How does that change the dynamic? How does that change the discussion? And do you feel as though those communities are being heard amid the continuing dialogue about white and African American relations?
Well, I think sometimes when we discuss affordable housing or when we discuss education or policing, like the Latino community is like an afterthought. The conversations are often black and white, even though we have about 12% Latino here in Charlotte. And when we talk about how do we make sure that people are able to live in this city, we fail to recognize that we have a sizable community that is undocumented. And how do we make sure that they're also part of Charlotte? They're Charlotteans, but we see them as foreigners, we see them as different. And when we start to do that, you begin to justify the type of conditions that they're living in or the type of oppressions that they're under. And so, part of my responsibility, just as a community member, is to advocate not only for myself and for my family, but for the people that I know that are just as deserving to live in a city where whenever they work, they're able to pay their housing, that their kids are able to go to a school and have a good education. And honestly, I think this city has failed to recognize that population, and it's still sometimes very hard to make either the police force or the city council or the county commissioners to understand that even though some people cannot vote because of the immigration status, that they have a responsibility to make their lives better in this place.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add on to that, a lot of the discussions that we were just having about displacement in neighborhoods are still very binary, black and white. It's a traditional African-American neighborhood with higher income, mostly whites coming in and integrating those neighborhoods and displacing. And Latino have been left out of that conversation. It just hasn't been part of that conversation. But I think what the trend we're seeing in the last couple of years now is more displacement has happened, and that happens house by house. The displacement we're now seeing is community by community, where entire 300-unit apartment complexes are being torn down to build new housing. And that, I think, in replacing family housing with housing for singles. And that's a fairly new conversation in Charlotte, maybe the last year or two. And that has huge effects on kind of all populations, because I think that affects everyone. So I think you're going to see that conversation become more prominent in the months, kind of the years to come.
And just to kind of give you an example, we have local elections happening at the moment, and including the school board. And there was a panel discussion, and one of a reporter from a local Spanish newspaper asked the people that were running for school board, do you know how many Latino students are in your district? And none of them could answer that question, right? I wonder if the people that are running for city council know how many Latinos are in their district or in the city of Charlotte or Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Like, that's how oblivious they are. And when you don't even recognize that people are there, you don't recognize what they need. What is the
number in the K-12 system? What is it, 30%?
So it's about 3 out of 5 students in Charlotte, in CMS. Maybe, James, you have a better number. But
we're a vastly majority minority school district.
Right.
And we don't have any type of representation, whether it's in the school board, in city council, county commissioners, and like that support is not there. And when people voice it, it's like, why? Like, there's not a willingness to engage even in this conversation.
And if I could just tell really quickly, I think we need to be transparent, and I think even for a lot of black folks, that's a blind spot. Because we've been so entrenched, and I do, in the bookends of the racial hierarchy and all those battles, I think we oftentimes forget that when we talk about people of color, that when you look at most of those categories, Latino folk are right down there with black folk. I mean, the group with the highest rate of poverty in Mecklenburg is Latinx people. Absolutely.
So, as the quote from John Hickenlooper kind of suggested, Charlotte is not the only city dealing with this question of, even amid fast growth, how do you expand opportunity to all the communities in your area? I mean, it's true in Seattle, it's true in Austin, it's true in Denver, even San Jose. Places that are doing the best are grappling with these issues of concentrated poverty, segregation, high concentrations of poverty in the schools. One thing, though, that makes Charlotte somewhat unusual is that you have tried to at least examine these, and we heard these earlier, kind of talking, not doing maybe, but you've tried to examine these more systematically, and you served on a task force that looked directly at this issue of opportunity and upward mobility, inspired by the Raj Chetty results, came out with your report this spring. You identified several areas out of all the different possibilities, and obviously there are a lot of different places. You picked 3 policy areas and 2 kind of more cross-cutting as the levers that you thought were the most important. Can you explain what they were and why you chose those? Why you think those are the place where you can make the biggest dent?
Sure. So one qualification is I didn't actually serve on the task force, so I don't want to take credit for them, but I do fully endorse the work that they did in the report. I think the reason that they chose those 5 areas, so being cross-cutting factors, segregation/racialization, social capital, early care and education, college and career access, and then family stability, is because even when you look at the Chetty study, some of those are the very same correlates, the determining factors there. And then there are some very contextual things about Charlotte's history that are acknowledged in that document and how we got here. And so when you chunk those things out, that's why I think, when we talk about the 3 determinants, I also want to say those are flanked between cross-cutting factors, things that are seeped into everything. So
segregation and social capital.
Yeah, you can't tease those apart from all the various other things. But when you look at trying to create a generational shift and a change in the structures, every system, and this is David Stroh's quote, but every system is designed to achieve whatever it's accomplishing, right? So the question is whether that's intentional or not. Which gets into some more debate. But we have to look at the systems, and when you look at what a system is, taking a child from really prenatal all the way through to high school, to career, and then eventually to prosperity, you have to look at it as kind of where do we on-ramp or off-ramp kids to give them the best opportunity for success. So that's how they came up with those factors.
And I want to zero in on one for a moment, early childhood, and maybe bring in everybody on this, because the report talks about the value of universal pre-K for 4-year-olds. Is there any momentum, life, interest in driving that forward in the community? What would it take for that to happen?
So what's interesting is you may know that the county just released a report kind of charting a pathway toward achieving potentially universal pre-K, sponsored by the CELC. And what they found is, from their polling data, is that, and this is astounding, in Charlotte and Mecklenburg, 70%, well, 90-some% are in favor of pre-K and see the value and utility. 70% said they'd be willing to raise their taxes by $10 a month. Check this out. 71% said they'd be willing to raise their taxes by $20 a month. So when you ask about momentum, clearly there's something there. People see the value in that, and this is the part about Charlotte and Mecklenburg that often gets overlooked. Do I think that everybody has an equity mindset and everybody wants everybody to prosper? Absolutely not. You can't say that about anywhere. I think there's enough people here, though. I think there's enough people here who care, who want to live in a beloved community, who don't want to otherize other folks, who think that prosperity is not a pie, right? Where if you get more, that means I get less. So I think there's momentum around that, potentially, if something like that can be endorsed and be voted on by county commissioners.
Brenda, you're an historian. I'm interested, traditionally, historically, looking at Charlotte, you had the unrest, the uprising last fall. What has been the reaction in the past to that kind of emergence? Is it a circling the wagons, or does it get a response? Which way does the city go?
Well, I think it's really important to also note that the protests actually took place in Center City, which is technically the economic hub of our city. And oftentimes when we talk about urban unrest, it often takes place in sort of African American or communities of color. I absolutely think that the protests taking place right here in Center City made it a real priority. It made it a significant priority. It put it on, it became part of the DNA of our dialogue. And so I think that's important to note. What I also think is important to note is the folks that were participating in the protests. It was not a sort of police against Black people. It was one of the most diverse groups of people that I have seen in this city. come together over issues that they believe are a shared responsibility. And so I think it's important to note that. I also think it's important to note that it became a platform for talking about other issues, not just simply
Right.
officer-involved shootings,
Right.
but also housing, also schools,
Right.
also a whole host of issues that can't be ignored when we talk about social and economic mobility challenges in our city.
I want to follow up on that, but Oliver, you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I think one of the important things to understand is that when the uprising happened, and I, like many other people, were out there, like the people that were in the streets, that were not talking about affordable housing or education, right, or higher pay. They were talking about police shooting people and not being accountable. And that hasn't changed. Like, we had Ruben Galindo, who was killed by CMPD with his hands up. Like, that video is out there, and that's something to recognize, right? Later on, one of the changes that happened is that people started, pulling out their wallets and say, this is, people that had the money, of course, say this is a problem, right? And we saw a lot of donations to organizations that, were doing work. But honestly, a year out, we haven't seen that type of change, that noticeable change. And another thing is that we've had task force before. We had an immigration task force that came out to outline a series of recommendations, and the city really hasn't done much until recently. They're trying to hire one person, when the recommendations call for an office of New Charlotteans that would address education, economic mobility, and these things. Those recommendations kind of have gone out the way, and now we have a new task force, right? New recommendations, and so I hope that that they put some intent behind that, but I'll wait and see what happens, because I guess this happened before and nothing's changed.
Yeah, Lee, did you want to? No. Oh, okay. So let me ask this then. I will ask you a question, because the Opportunity Task Force, as James noted, put a lot of weight on segregation as a root of many of the inequities and disparities in the community. Segregation stands apart as a cross-cutting factor because it is foundational to everything else. Not only are we segregated by race and ethnicity, we are also segregated by wealth and poverty. Are there opportunities to break that down, particularly in a community that's growing, or is that just a foundational fact of life in Charlotte?
I think growth presents an opportunity because one of the things that I learned as I was growing up and going through grad school is that surprised me is southern cities tend to be, on average, less segregated than northern cities, and a lot of that is because of growth. So the most integrated neighborhoods in Charlotte and in most places tend to be new neighborhoods because they have a fresh start. You build brand new housing, everybody moving there, it's kind of a blank slate. Now, they tend not to be very income integrated, but they kind of racially integrated. They're more so than kind of our neighborhoods that have just kind of always been the way they are. So what growth allows you is to kind of mix up the pot. Because if no one's moving to your city, if there's no new jobs, everything kind of stagnates. Everything just kind of stays the way it's always been, which is not where we want it to be. So growth presents opportunities, but you actually have to be intentional. You can't just let it kind of do what it's going to do, because what happens is the older neighborhoods are going to just stay the way they are unless you intentionally try to build new housing or stir the pot.
Also, alongside being intentional, I think you also have to think about it in an intersectional way as well. So when we think about what happened in terms of school desegregation, right? We also need to think about what it means to change the landscape of our housing, right? And one of the ways in which we experimented with that in the 1970s was through scattered site housing, which is to integrate low-income families into middle-income neighborhoods. The problem with that is when we actually reverted to, when we did away with busing as a mechanism for desegregating public schools in '99 with the Potter decision, as soon as we did that, roughly 4 years later, what we realized is that we had not developed a sustained program for more integrated neighborhoods, which meant that we reverted back to resegregated
very high
schools.
levels. And so let me ask you, because in the same way that you went through this Opportunity Task Force in a more visible, intentional way than many communities, you also went through a school assignment debate that was more visible and intentional than many other communities. And the school board came out with recommendations in May, I believe it was, or a plan in May of this year. the schools are having to deal with the reality of a segregated housing market. Right. How effective is what the schools came up with, in your mind, in creating a more economically and racially integrated
Me
experience?
Personally?
Yeah. You personally.
Speaking for James E. Ford and James E. Ford only, I was underwhelmed by it. Mm-hmm. I was underwhelmed by it. I thought that contextually, in a 2-year span, you had, Charlotte, and I was pretty vocal. I'm an educator. Yeah. Charlotte being outed for running a segregated school district when it once kind of taught the rest of the nation, right, how to desegregate. Not that all was well, but Charlotte had a prominent position. Then you also had headlines once we found out we were dead last in economic mobility. And then you had civil unrest take place in a 24-month period, and that was not enough to create the public will for us to take bold steps to rapidly help to desegregate and break up concentrations of poverty. Now, the task force report didn't weigh in what particular action, but we did say this is something that needs to be attended to. And that sends ripple effects because we know that school assignment and housing policy are inextricably linked. There's plenty of research around that. And so I think it puts the rest of us in a tougher position in terms of reshaping the opportunity structure. However, it doesn't excuse us from, especially other sectors, housing, et cetera, from continuing to take up bold steps and pick up where they left off. There's much more work to be done. You could argue some positive steps, but just it didn't have the impact. It wasn't bold what I expected.
Oliver, what was your take on it? What does it mean for your community, the communities where you work?
I think there might be other better people to answer this question than me.
Okay.
So,
Brenda?
I have no comments on it.
I'm still thinking about it.
I mean, the challenge with all of these, I think, is politicians are naturally conservative, not politically conservative, are naturally cautious. To your point, data like everyone will do $20 a month, 70% will help them because like, oh wait, I'm allowed to vote for this because they're not going to vote for a tax increase without a lot of data that says I'm not going to get voted out of office. And schools was similar. I think the fear that if you're too bold on the school assignment plan, that essentially half the kids will just leave the school system. That you'll end up worse off than you were before. It naturally creates caution. And so how we kind of push them to be a little bit more bold, I think is hard because that's what they're balancing.
In fairness to the schools, in any community, they are being asked to overcome a lot of other factors that are out there. When you're dealing with today, I think in Charlotte, 3/4 of African American and almost 4/5 of Latino kids are in schools where a majority of their classmates qualify as poor or low income, compared to only about 1/4 of white. So you have a stark racial differential in the concentration of poverty. Call up the second slide if we could. And that really goes to this question about whether you can equalize opportunity for kids without creating more equal opportunity for adults. So look at this. This is an interesting. There's a lot of numbers up there, but it basically tells you that if you look at the Charlotte metro area, the estimate is that about 42% of the jobs by 2020 will require some kind of post-secondary degree. 51% of whites, a very high number of US-born whites in the Charlotte metro have a college degree. When you look at US-born African Americans, it's 33%, Latino immigrants, 13%. So I guess my question is it right to focus only on expanding opportunity for kids, or can you realistically do that without equalizing more opportunity for the adults in their lives?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I mean, I think kids are a good focal point, but at the end of the day, I mean, they live in a household. They have to be fed today. Some kid at school needs to go home and be able to have a meal. They should be able to. And then when you look at the Chetty study, it talks about young families primarily. And really, the impact is most felt when those young families are able to move the child into a high opportunity neighborhood by the age 10. After 10 years old, there's a diminishing effect there, right? So, but it starts with that family unit and being able to offer opportunities, a livable wage for the folks who are probably in the service sector who may not be in the mid-skill or high-skill range, but are certainly deserving of being able to provide for themselves, certainly deserving of having affordable housing. They have children. And so I think you can't separate the two or bifurcate them. You have to be able to concentrate on kids, but the way of doing that is by starting with families.
In the communities where you work, do adults see a way, do they see a ladder? Do they see a way to move up economically, either through training or to find better paying jobs, or is there largely a feeling of being stuck in place?
So I don't speak for the whole community, but I would say, not everybody in this community is undocumented. Some of them are, but we do see, what I see is there's some a mixed status families. Sometimes the kids are US born and then the parents are not. And that complicates things because they don't have access to those opportunities, like even training or these systems that are supposed to help people but because they have a different immigration status, they don't have access to them. And one of the things that as a community, I think what we've been trying to do is to make sure that those parents feel safe in this city, because it's hard to provide for your kids when you're not in this country. And so that, we've had earlier this year, we had ICE raids in the city, and there was really a lack of response from the community because they happen in immigrant centers, like in the east side, and there really hasn't been that type of solidarity from the other parts of the community. So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does, absolutely. Let's go to the audience for a couple questions. We have microphones. If we have one down here and one back there. Yeah, so we'll get this one next. Down here, next. Just hold on, we got someone back there.
Yeah, my name is Brandon Lazarus, and I'm a pastor at Memorial United Methodist. There's a member of our community who is undocumented. He had a heart attack. His heart stopped for 2.5 minutes before he was brought back. He now can't work for 6 months, and because he's undocumented, does not have disability, does not have access to food stamps, does not have any of those resources. So Oliver, if you could speak a little bit to our undocumented brothers and sisters and the added economic disadvantage of not having access to certain resources.
Yeah, so I would say right now I'm very fortunate to have a job where I get healthcare, but I did not see a doctor for 10 years. Or a dentist for 10 years, because it's an economic burden, and when you're living paycheck to paycheck, that's something that you just can't do, right? Either you eat or you go to the doctor. And my family, they're still facing those things. There's some low income clinics, but some of them don't provide for service to undocumented folks. Some of them do, some of them don't. One of the things, the interesting things that people don't really even think about, that there's, we call it, I don't know if there's Spanish-speaking folks here, but El Salvador. These are folks that are, you go and if you have an ache, you go to this person and they I don't know what they do, massage you and do things that are they don't have actual formal educational training, but they are service providers for the community, coming from the community, and that's a burden that for a lot of people, you wait until it's an emergency and you go to the emergency care, and people say that's a burden, but they're paying taxes, so they should have access to that too.
Question over here.
Thank you. Aya Sudama, founder of Charlotte Bush Vihara Monastery and president of Shamrock Hills Neighborhood Association. I'm really in touch with some of my poorest neighbors, aware of the one, for example, who can't pay his electric bill, so he lives in a house that technically worthy of being condemned, therefore he can't get certain repairs done and so on. And another neighbor is telling me about the food banks cutting back. Now you have to have not gone to this or that food bank within 90 days. So there are long gaps between ability of times to get to food banks. My question for you is, who is tracking the nickeling and diming of the poorest of the poor, such as the raising of the cost of the 10-ride bus pass, which is the ticket for the poorest of the poor? That was a city council decision made after that study found us dead last. And another decision to cause the apartment buildings to have to pay for the removal of trash. Yes, that affected some very wealthy apartments, but also the poorest of the poor. And we're about to get, I don't see any big momentum to stop this, Duke Power from raising the base rate, not the rate. You can turn off your lights all you want, but you still gotta pay that basic cost. And again, your house is condemned if you don't do it, and you can't live you can't rent the house, you can't live it. It's this is a matter of being homed or homeless, that Duke Power thing. Who's working on this? Who's bringing this to the attention of our elected officials? Thank you.
Do you want to, James or Brenda, do you want to start?
I think what you just suggested is a clarion call for ensuring that the people at the table aren't just, it's not a top-down conversation. That we understand the grievances across that difference. And I think it's time for us to be sure that when we have these kinds of forums, that it includes the voices and perspectives of our most vulnerable citizens, frankly. And so I think, I don't know who's doing all of the data collection, but I think what you've suggested is that there is a clarion call to be sure that these conversations are more well-rounded and that the policies and decisions that we make as a community reflect that. We have to go from asking the question or saying that Charlotte is a place that has a lot. We have to start asking the question for who.
Yeah. Before you jump in, James, I want to put one more spin on that question. And maybe it's almost as a closing note, because we're near that point. I've been struck all day in listening to all these conversations and in the conversation we had last night in advance of this, that in talking about all these issues of equity, there's elections and elected officials seem very far away from the. I mean, you're electing a mayor in a few weeks in this city after a very dramatic primary where you ousted your current mayor. To what extent are the kinds of questions we're talking about equity here, in economic opportunity, in the schools, in the criminal justice system, to what extent are they part of the political debate here? To what extent do you look to political leaders for answers and leadership on this? And to what extent is it really kind of community leaders trying to find solutions among themselves because they don't have a lot of faith that the political system will respond?
I think it's largely political. And I would categorize everything we're talking about in three different ways. I call them personally the 3 Ps. I think that the change we're talking about starts with people. I believe in democracy in the sense that naturally the people are the ones who have the power, right? So it's people who are going to make the change. It's not a council of people. It's not people who are heads of institutions. At the end of the day, the people are the ones who hold the power. The second P is programs. I think there's lots of opportunity out here, folks who are doing good work who we don't even know about. Yes. We know about the bigger ones, those who are funded, those who have budgets, but there's folks in neighborhoods doing really good work who we don't get to see, who need to be elevated and need to have their capacity expanded. A lot of community organizing, et cetera. They got to be at the table. And lastly is policies. We're not a political organization in the sense that we're partisan, but whenever you talk about policies, you're going to have to deal with politics. And it takes electing individuals who express a willingness to create the sort of policies and the policy environment that helps to get those things done. And the people make that decision ultimately.
Thank you. Lee, you have a relevant, because I mean, obviously the private sector can do a lot on housing, but ultimately can it do it without public policy that pushes in the right direction?
We don't really do anything, on virtually no project we do we not do without some sort of public funding. So, and Charlotte has stepped up over many years, 10 to 15 years on funding affordable housing, but I think we need to give them political cover to do more. There is a big debate that's happening, not yet publicly, of when we go every 2 years to do a new bond referendum for affordable housing, that amount is probably going to go up, but how much more will it go up? And essentially, if you get to a certain point where that starts to affect tax rate, people have to give politicians cover to do that, because they're not going to go raise taxes unless they feel like they can do it and not just get thrown out in the next election. We have elections every 2 years, so it can be very quick. So we have to give them that cover.
Brenda, all our thoughts on this?
I think equity has to have purchase in this community, sustainable purchase. In other words, I don't think that we should mobilize around the concept of equity only when we're having an intergenerational social and economic mobility conundrum. That it has to be part of the Charlotte way. We have to redefine what that means, both rhetorically, but what that means in practice, day in, day out. So this is not something that should be short-term. I think it needs to be part of our long-term approach to community building.
Oliver,
I think, I've stopped believing in politicians and started believing in the power that people have to make change. And there's a lot of money here in this city. I think what we need is courage, because that I haven't seen. And one of the things we haven't touched on is how HB2 has changed the outlook of our local elected officials, who take that as an excuse to not be more forward-thinking and more progressive. And so I think we have to keep them accountable. And they have their job, but they are accountable to community. And so I think the community also has a job to play.
Well, this has been a great panel. Will you join me in thanking them?